Chapter 2. New Neighbors. Mother Conway was dishing up the supper of turnip greens, roast buffalo hump, and beans, and Thad was putting them on the table along with big pitchers of milk and buttermilk when they heard Mr. Conway riding into the yard. Thad said, "Somebody's with Pa, and it isn't Trav, nor any of our hands. I wonder who it could be," Thad's mother said, taking the big pan of hot biscuits from her new oven. Just then his father came into the kitchen, and sure enough, a man and a boy were with him. The boy, dark and slim and unsmiling, appeared to be a year or two older than Thad. He seemed to be shy. "Louisa," Mr. Conway said, "meet our new neighbor, Mr. Wiley Branson." Thad stared at the boy, who looked back with level gaze, but neither of them spoke. "This is my son Buford," Mr. Branson said, "Bew for short." Each nodded, Thad's white head and Bew's black one bobbing in unison. "Howdy," each of them said. The Conways heard that a new family had moved in on the open range about 12 miles south, and they had been anxious to meet them. Louisa Conway and Ellie Clark had talked of going to visit the new lady. Women were a scarcity among the Bayou in these days, although a good number of families had moved into the area. But they were widely scattered, and some of the ranches were being opened by single men, so the women folk looked forward to getting together once or twice a year. They relied on any sort of excuse that could be thought up, any excuse, that is, good enough to induce the men to go with them. Men did not like the women to take risks of riding far alone because of Indians. There were so many white men in the country who could not be trusted entirely. This was still a lawless country. The more so since the soldiers had been called away to take part in the war. Branson sat down to dinner with the Conways and their hired help. Travis and Ben Atkins came in from the branding corral just as the meal started. "Well, Mr. Conway," said Mr. Branson, "I see you've been on a buffalo hunt. How far did you have to go?" "Not more than a day's wagon ride," Mr. Conway said. "Closest they've come to our country for a good many years." This part of the country was too heavily wooded in spots for the larger herds of bison to run in. But Samps Conway and his sons had been out on the plains a week ago and had brought home a whole wagon load of buffalo meat. Thad would never forget anything that happened the day the Bransons had dinner with them. Seeing the first two members of the Branson family made it an important day for him, more so than he realized at the time. Wiley and Bew Branson left soon after dinner. "Now you all come down and see us just as soon as you can, Mrs. Conway," Wiley said as they were leaving. "Marcella gets mighty lonesome. She's never been far away from her own kin before, and she isn't taking it too well. Her folks are all back in Kentucky except one sister who lives in San Antonio. Well, we'll be down there just as soon as Ellie Clark and I can get our menfolk to go with us," Louisa Conway promised. "You come too," Bew said to Thad. Although he had said little since coming into the house, Thad had felt drawn to him. Thad, with his white thatch of hair and his face as speckled as a turkey egg, with his cheerful disposition and lively ways, liked the quietness and the dark, handsome look of his new friend. Thad had never had boys or girls near his own age for friends, but Buse said he had two sisters at home. One was near Thad's own age, which was about 12, and the other was 9. You couldn't keep me away, he said in answer to Bugh's invitation. I'll be right proud to see your sisters. The surest way to get anywhere in those days was on horseback, unless you liked walking, which no one did. Everybody rode a horse, even women like Louisa Conway. She had been riding all her life and could sit a horse as well as any man. Louisa Conway and Ellie Clark kept urging their husbands to take a day off for a visit with the Bransons, but the men kept putting them off. Thad was anxious, as the women folk, to make the trip. Finally, Mrs. Conway said, Samson, a week from today, Ellie Clark and I are going to spend the day with Mrs. Branson. If you men folk want to go along with us, I reckon you'll be welcome. If not, then we'll get along with what protection Thad can give us. Thad was sure then that they were going, for when his mother called his father Samson, he knew her mind was made up. Father knew it too. It was not really as bad as Mother Conway made it sound, for both she and Ellie Clark were an expert with a gun as any man or boy in the country. So it was that one spring morning dawned, when the redbirds and the mockingbirds and the gentle-voiced bluebirds were trying out their first songs of the day, Mrs. Ellie Clark, whom Thad always called Miss Ellie, according to Southern custom, joined Thad and his mother at the Conway gate. Ellie was riding a tough little buckskin pony that had a black stripe from mane to tail. In the front of Ellie was a little boy, and another one rode behind her. Ma rode Travis's Blue Hornet, a strong, active horse that could smell an Indian as far away as any dog. Thad was on Little Bit, who would also warn of Indians when they started down the creek trail that the cattle had made. They traveled in a southward direction across rolling prairie, with dim blue rim rocks and ridges in the distance. The air was sweet with the heady perfume of buffalo clover, known today as bluebonnets, which for miles on end turned the earth into a reflection of the blue sky. On some slopes were acres of gold, where corpus blossoms waved on their tall stems. It was a wide and seemingly empty land. To Thad, it was full of wonders and surprises. When the sun rose high, it beat on the heads of the riders, who were glad when the path dipped into the cool tree shade depths of the creek. At last they sighted a cluster of wagons at the bend in the creek and saw scattered herds of the bisons of the Branson spread. Mrs. Branson was expecting them, for Ben Atkins and Travis had been down this way a few days before and told her of Mother Conway's plans. Mmm, victuals, Tim exclaimed when they caught the odor of food cooking on the outdoor fire. A middle-aged, plump black woman tended the cooking. She was Aunt Dulcie, wife of Uncle Wash. Both of them worked for the Branson family. Thad had seen Uncle Wash once when he was riding after cattle with the men. Breakfast was a long time ago, Thad remarked as they approached, and I'm starving. 12 miles of riding had given him an appetite. You'll have to wait at least 3 hours, Thad, his mother reminded him. It isn't more than 9 o'clock now. We're still living in the wagons, Mrs. Branson apologized, but she pointed to where the men had laid a foundation for a house and had a rock chimney half built. Marcella Branson was a small, friendly woman with dark, flashing eyes. Her crisp, wavy hair was drawn into a knot at the back of her neck. She talked softly but rapidly with a smooth, flowing accent that Thad had never heard before. Later, he learned why her speech was different from that of Ben Atkins, although both of them were from Kentucky. Mrs. Branson had been a schoolteacher before she was married and was careful of her English. Most of the people of Central Texas in that day were not. Thad noticed that the white collar of her blue dress was fashioned with a cameo pen. The letter M was worked into the wrought gold of its lower edge. Besides Bew, there was another boy, 3 years old, 3-year old Stevie, with golden hair and his mother's bright brown eyes. He seemed to be the pet of the whole family, especially of his older sister and of Aunt Dulcie. To Thad, the most attractive members of the family were Melissa and Cecilia. Lissy and Celia, they were called, two pretty girls Thad had never seen before, and he thought never would he see any so pretty again. His experience with girls was admittedly scant, for besides the Morton girls, several years older than he, who lived 15 miles northeast on Lonesome Creek, and some cousins he had met on a trip to Fort Worth, he had never known any girls. Thad was only a rough frontier ranch boy, but he loved anything pretty. He could scarcely take his eyes from the two little girls, Melissa with her dark, curly hair and intensely blue eyes, and Cecilia with hair the color of honey in a clear glass and dark, red-brown eyes. They were dressed alike except that Celia wore a pink and white striped dress, while Lissy was blue and white. "Come on down to the creek and I'll show you something," Bo invited. But before they started, Melissa brought some cookies for them. "Aunt Dulcie says these will stay our stomachs until dinner time," she said. Thad was sure they would not spoil his dinner, so munching cookies, he followed the three others toward the sheds their father had built a little way from the creek bank. They went down a little trail through a thick growth of sumac until they reached the creek bed, where tall trees grew between high banks. There, a dark pool of water where the spring floods had washed a hole at the bend in the creek. A giant cottonwood tree leaned out over the pool, keeping it in the shade, in deep shade. On the opposite bank, other old trees leaned across and mingled their branches with those that reached out to meet them. It was a dark and mysterious place. Thad thought it would be a wonderful spot for a boy to have a secret hideaway, and that it was just what Bo Branson and his sisters had made there. When Thad was led through the thick underbrush, he saw a faint trail on the bank above the pool. Bo lifted a screen of wild plum and sumac bushes and revealed the mouth of a cave. They went inside. Bo dropped the screening branches, and it was almost as dark as a cellar. No one would have expected or suspected the existence of such a cave, so perfectly was it hidden from public view. There was a shelf dug from the wall of the cave on one side. Some candles were there, and Bo lit one. On the shelf also was a row of tin boxes that caught Thad's eyes. "What are those?" he asked. "That's our kitchen safe," Melissa explained. "Bo lets us play here too, and that is for our fort. When we play Indians, we come in here to hide from them." "What have you got in the safe?" Thad asked. Melissa opened the boxes one by one, and the first was some jerky or dried beef. It would keep for a long time if it did not get damp. In another, there was some dried biscuits and cornbread. In one, there was a handful of dried peaches and some dried apples. In the last, there were several cookies. Melissa was still carrying two of the cookies she had brought from the wagons, and Celie had one. These they put into the cookie box and took out some of the older ones, which were no longer very soft. I put these in here last week. We'll eat them now and save our new cookies for the next time we come, Melissa explained. Thad laughed. I never saw such little squirrels for hoarding victuals, he said. They stayed and played Indians and settlers until they heard Mrs. Branson calling them to dinner. Thad had never had so much real fun. Thad did full justice to the dinner. Afterward, Melissa, who seemed to be something of a tomboy in spite of her dainty appearance, said, "Come on, let's show Thad the Bob White's nest." A little way from the wagons, beneath the bush, was the Bob White's nest. They wanted to show Thad. When Thad saw the 18 eggs in it, he was thrilled. "Mustn't touch 'em," Melissa warned him, "or the mother won't come back." "I know," he said. "I've got one near our house and that I'm watching. But there are only 12 eggs in it. I'm fixing to get me a couple of pet Bob Whites from the bunch." How are you going to do? How are you going to catch them?" Bo wanted to know. Thad knew then that Bo had not lived in the country very long, or he wouldn't have needed to ask such a question. "Just before they hatch, I'm going to put some of them under our old setting hen and let her finish hatching them." Thad had to leave for home then, for his mother was calling. It had been one of the happiest days of his life. He had never realized until now that he was so lonely, or that he needed the friendship of other boys and girls. As he rode toward home with his mother and Miss Ellie, Thad lagged behind, thinking about the Bransons. Girls, he decided, were something special. They were not rough like boys. They were pretty and gentle in their ways. At least the Branson girls were. He made up his mind that if they did not come to visit soon, he would make an opportunity to go down and see them again. His mother could not get away very often, but his father or some of the men would be riding that way now and then looking after the cattle. His father was short-handed because of the war, so even Thad had to spend hours in the saddle helping with the work. He would try to manage it so that he would be along the next time any of the men had to ride south toward the Bransons. They had gone perhaps 6 miles along the home trail when suddenly Little Bit pricked up her ears, snorted, and began pulling at the bit. She showed every sign of wanting to get away from that neighborhood fast. Thad knew the signs. He put his spurs to her and caught up with his mother and Miss Ellie. "Ma, there's Indians. Little Bit says they're somewhere close. She smells them." Blue Hornet was acting the same way now, and Mother said, "Here, Ellie, give me one of those young ones." She stopped her horse, reached over and took little Tommy Clark, and set him in front of her on the saddle. Then a faraway, dull thumping sound reached Thad's ears. Indian drums! His ears were as sharp as a coyote's. The woman had not heard the sounds. "Ma, don't you hear those drums?" "I do," Miss Ellie cried. "Indian drums." Mother Conway listened for a second. Then she heard it, the rhythmic thumping of distant drums. "Let's head for home fast," she cried. No one needed urging. Even the horses ran as fast as they could, pumping their legs. The drums could only mean one thing. There was an Indian camp not far away, and the horses sensed the danger. Any frontier horse that had ever spent time in the hands of the Comanches knew their cruelty and dreaded it. An arrow zinged past Little Bit's head, letting them know they were being pursued. Dropping behind the women, Thad watched the trees along the creek and cocked his gun, a Colt 45 his father always made him carry. Little Bit fought her bits to keep up with the others, but Thad held her back. A movement, no more than a flutter of a bird, it seemed, caught his eye, and it was among the bushes at the edge of the timber. Thad shot toward it, then gave Little Bit her head. There were no more arrows. After a little, they eased up on their pace. Ellie Clark's little one had not let out a murmur. They were frontier babies. 3 miles from home, they met Father Conway and Ben Atkins coming towards them. We got worrying about you all, Father exclaimed. After Ben came in from down this way, he said he heard Indian drums. Yes, we heard them too, Mother told him. We hurried for a while after that. They shot at us too, Miss Ellie said, but Thad scared them away. His father looked at Thad approvingly. Good for you, son, he said. I reckon you'll do. Thad squirmed with embarrassment. Aw, it wasn't anything, he said. I suspect it was just a few young braves that chased us, Mother said. They were out to make some scalps and horses the easy way. Well, you shouldn't go off by yourselves any more, Father told them. Next time there might be more than a few young braves, and they'll get you. It isn't safe. Mrs. Clark laughed quietly. Living in this part of Texas isn't safe any way you look at it, Mr. Conway, she said. But we won't be taking any more chances than we have to. Father shook his head as he unsettled in the lot. I'm powerfully afraid that we're in for a lot of Comanche raiding this summer, he said. It's mighty early for them to be sneaking around so close to the settlements.